The hum of quiet conversation floated through the cabin. A thin trail of perfume, champagne, and expensive leather lingered in the air. Every sound seemed softened, civilized, until I stepped in. The flight attendant's smile was wide for the couple ahead of me. Perfect teeth, perfect warmth. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond. Always a pleasure." Her laughter followed them like sunlight. Then her eyes met mine. The warmth died. "Welcome aboard," she said again, shorter this time, clipped at the edges, like she was already done with me. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The shift was familiar. You can always tell when someone decides what you are before you've said a word. The aisle was narrow, but the distance between us felt far wider. Her smile reappeared the moment the white man behind me rolled his suitcase forward. It was like watching a switch flip. Polite for some, performative for others. I moved toward my seat near the front, the sound of her cheerful tone fading behind me as she greeted the next passenger like she hadn't just iced me moments ago. The cabin glowed with luxury, soft lighting, muted gold fixtures, champagne bubbling quietly in crystal glasses. Around me, passengers reclined, scrolling through phones or tapping messages, faces framed by quiet privilege. I placed my bag beneath my seat and exhaled slowly. Then I felt it. Her eyes. She stood a few rows ahead, pretending to adjust a seatbelt but watching me. Her gaze lingered like a question she was too polite to voice but too biased to ignore. Her posture said it all. "You don't belong here." I straightened slightly, not out of defiance, just comfort, because I did belong here. Every inch of this seat, every privilege it represented, I had earned. Her voice broke the silence. "Ma'am, I think you may be in the wrong section." My eyes lifted to hers, steady. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She blinked, maybe surprised I didn't apologize or scramble for a boarding pass. A few heads turned. A man in a charcoal suit looked up from his laptop. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband. The flight attendant's smile tightened. "This section is reserved for our elite passengers." "I'm aware," I replied. "You might want to check your list." "I don't need to," she said, voice cooling further. "I know who belongs here." A murmur rolled through the rows, quick, uncomfortable, curious. Someone whispered, "She probably moved up by mistake." Another added, "They always try it." I heard every word. I'd heard versions of it my entire life. The sound didn't sting anymore. It just confirmed what I already knew. Some people still confuse confidence for intrusion. The attendant leaned closer. "I'm giving you one more chance to move before boarding completes." My reply was calm. "Call whoever you need to." For a moment, we just stared at each other. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned on her heel sharply, but her steps faltered halfway down the aisle. The man in the suit watched her go, shaking his head slowly. I leaned back in my seat and fastened the belt. The cabin air felt thicker now, the whispers heavier. I looked straight ahead, unbothered. If she wanted a scene, she'd have to build it herself, because I wasn't moving, not an inch. If this moment pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how it unfolds. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? The seatbelt light flickered overhead. The attendant's heels clicked closer again. She stopped beside me, the fake smile gone this time. Her voice dropped low, controlled, cold. "Then don't say I didn't warn you." The flight hadn't even left the ground, but something was about to take off, and it wasn't the plane. She came back faster than I expected, her heels striking the aisle carpet like punctuation marks. There was no smile this time, only that look people wear when they think they're enforcing order. "Ma'am," she began, her tone honeyed but hollow, "this section is for our elite passengers." A few heads lifted immediately. First-class passengers love a little drama, especially when they believe it doesn't concern them. I glanced up slowly. "I believe this is my seat." Her jaw tightened. "I'm sure it's an honest mistake. Economy's just behind you." The man in the charcoal suit across the aisle paused mid-scroll, watching over the rim of his glasses. Behind him, a woman with pearls leaned toward her husband, whispering behind her manicured hand. "She probably walked up here by mistake," she said. Lauren didn't correct her. She didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words could. I unbuckled my seatbelt, not to move, but to reach for my boarding pass. "If you'd like, I can show you my seat number." "That won't be necessary," she snapped too quickly. Her eyes darted toward the back of the cabin where another attendant, younger, nervous-looking, was watching the exchange. "Grace." She clutched a manifest, fidgeting with the corner of the paper. Lauren gestured sharply. "Grace, it's handled." Grace hesitated. "But ma'am, I could just confirm." "I said it's handled." Lauren's voice cut through the air. Grace's eyes flickered toward me for half a second. An unspoken apology. Then she turned away. I remained seated. My tone didn't rise. My hands stayed folded neatly in my lap. "I'll be right here if you'd like to double-check." Lauren's nostrils flared. "That won't be necessary," she repeated, but the tremor in her voice betrayed irritation, not authority. Around us, whispers swelled like a current. Someone muttered, "Why not just move?" Another said, "They should really check those tickets better." I'd heard enough of those comments in boardrooms, restaurants, and airports to know exactly what they meant. The words changed, but the meaning never did. "You don't belong here." Lauren crossed her arms. "I'm giving you one more chance to move to your proper section before I call security." I tilted my head slightly. "You can call whoever you need to." Her lips pressed into a line thin enough to cut glass. "Fine," she hissed under her breath, pivoting on her heel. Grace appeared again at the end of the aisle, eyes full of quiet panic. She tried to catch Lauren's attention, whispering something low, but Lauren brushed past her. The man in the suit leaned forward slightly. "Maybe you should check the manifest," he said, voice even. Lauren shot him a look sharp enough to slice. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter of protocol." He leaned back, unimpressed. "Looks more like a matter of assumption." The words landed like a spark. Heads turned. The woman with pearls quickly faced her magazine again, pretending to read. Lauren drew a breath through her teeth. I could see the effort it took her not to lash out. She glanced toward the cockpit, as if hoping for an escape, then straightened her uniform. "I'll get this clarified," she said tightly, vanishing toward the galley. As she disappeared, Grace inched closer, lowering her voice. "I'm sorry about that, ma'am. I saw your name on the list earlier." I gave her a small nod. "Then you already know I'm not the one in the wrong seat." She nodded once, hesitant but sincere, before hurrying off again when Lauren's voice called her from the galley. For a moment, the cabin returned to quiet, the kind that hums with unspoken judgment. I could feel every stolen glance, every subtle shift in posture. That's the thing about prejudice. It rarely starts loud. It starts in the spaces between words, in the tone that pretends politeness while testing your limits. Discrimination doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just smiles and asks for your boarding pass. The seatbelt light went off, and the cabin came alive with quiet luxury. Trays clinking, champagne fizzing, polite laughter floating like perfume. The attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, their polished smiles and crisp voices choreographed for comfort. Lauren had found her rhythm again. Her voice was warm, her movements fluid, her charm flawless. But it skipped right over me. "Mr. Raymond, would you care for a top-up?" she asked, her laughter light, genuine even. The older man smiled as she handed him another glass of champagne with practiced elegance. She leaned in, chatted for a moment, then moved on, serving the man behind me, the couple across the aisle. Everyone, except me. She walked past my row like I was invisible. The tray passed inches from my shoulder, the bottles gleaming under the soft lights. I waited. When she looped back toward the front, I spoke quietly. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Her steps slowed, her head tilting slightly but never turning. "When I get the chance," she said curtly, then continued walking as if the air beside her had spoken. The businessman behind me lowered his glass slightly. I caught his reflection in the brass trim near the window, his brow furrowed, his jaw set. From across the aisle, the woman in pearls whispered to her husband again. "She should just wait her turn," she said softly, but not softly enough. I sat back, hands folded in my lap, waiting. The hum of the engines was steady, but the silence between me and the aisle was louder. Lauren came down again, this time with a tray of water glasses, each one placed carefully, elegantly, onto linen napkins. She served row after row, smile fixed and charming. When she reached me, she didn't even pause. Her tray brushed past my shoulder, and she handed the next passenger their drink instead. The businessman behind me shook his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. I didn't react. Some battles don't begin with words. They begin with patience. A few minutes later, Lauren turned to walk back toward the galley. My knee shifted slightly, just enough to ease the stiffness from sitting still. She saw it. Instead of stepping aside, she veered closer. The edge of her shoe caught my shin. The tray tilted. Ice water splashed across my lap. Sharp, cold, deliberate. Gasps followed. The couple in front froze mid-conversation. Lauren's performance began instantly. "Watch where you put your feet," she said, voice pitched high enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Now look at the mess you've caused." I looked down, water dripping off the fabric of my slacks, a napkin already soaking through. Slowly, I lifted my gaze back to her. "You walked into me," I said evenly. Her lips curved in a mock smile. "If you'd stayed in your space, this wouldn't have happened." The businessman behind me exhaled sharply. The woman in pearls pretended not to watch. I dabbed my lap with the napkin, movements unhurried. "All I've asked is respect," I said quietly. Her eyes hardened. "Maybe," she said, leaning in slightly. "You're sitting where respect costs extra." The line hung in the air, venom disguised as wit, the kind of sentence meant to sting without consequence. I met her gaze, calm, unwavering. "If that's how you define respect, you've already paid too much." For the first time, her expression faltered, just slightly. The businessman shifted in his seat, murmuring, "Good for you." Lauren straightened her posture, color rising in her cheeks. She turned on her heel, the tray trembling in her hand as she walked briskly down the aisle. Behind her perfect smile, something had cracked, small but visible. And though I didn't yet know it, that single glass of water had already started the downfall of her entire career. Lauren returned from the galley, her jaw tight, her tray now empty. She wasn't smiling anymore. Whatever mask of professionalism she'd worn had slipped. The air shifted with her, thick with the tension of an ego on the verge of cracking. She stopped at my row, arms folded. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she hissed, voice low enough to sound controlled, but loud enough to invite attention. The businessman behind me shifted in his seat. The woman in pearls leaned forward again, unable to look away. Every eye in first class was on us now. I met her glare without flinching. "I think I can ask to be treated like everyone else." Her lips twitched. "You people always think someone owes you something." The words were quiet but clear, and heavy enough to suck the oxygen from the aisle. Gasps rippled. Even Grace, standing near the galley, froze mid-step. "Excuse me?" I said, voice calm but cutting. Lauren leaned closer. "Don't play innocent. I've been doing this job long enough to know the type." Her tone wasn't about service anymore. It was about dominance, the kind people mistake for authority. I straightened in my seat. "Then you should also know what happens when people abuse their position." The smirk that followed was sharp and reckless. "Abuse? You've been disruptive since boarding." Her voice rose, filling the cabin. The calm background music, the soft conversations, all of it vanished. Passenger stopped mid-sentence. Even the captain's door cracked slightly open. "Ma'am," she said louder, gesturing toward me as though addressing the crowd, "I've asked you repeatedly to cooperate. I didn't move, and I've asked you to respect me." Her eyes flashed, a warning that I didn't need. Then, in one sudden motion, she raised her hand and struck me. The sound split the air like a crack of thunder. Sharp, unmistakable. Gasps erupted across the cabin. A glass hit the floor somewhere near row 2. A child whispered, "She hit her," before being shushed by his mother. Grace dropped the manifest in her hands, her eyes wide in disbelief. The businessman behind me stood halfway from his seat, fists clenched at his sides. Lauren froze, her palms still hovering midair as if she herself couldn't believe what she'd done. Her breathing quickened. "You've been nothing but trouble," she blurted. "Maybe now you'll learn some manners." The sting burned, but my silence burned hotter. I didn't touch my face. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I looked straight into her eyes, steady, unbroken. "You've crossed the line," I said quietly. The stillness that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade beneath it. She stepped back slightly, suddenly unsure. "Don't look at me like that," she muttered, her voice trembling. I didn't reply. The businessman spoke up first. "Did we all just see that?" His tone was sharp, angry. A murmur spread through the cabin, disbelief, outrage, guilt from those who'd stayed silent too long. Grace took a tentative step forward, her voice shaking. "Miss Lauren, you can't just... Stay out of this." Lauren snapped, but the authority in her tone was gone. It sounded more like fear now. I reached down, lifted my phone from the armrest, and unlocked it slowly, deliberately. No rush, no panic. My fingers moved with purpose. Lauren's eyes flicked to the screen. "What are you doing?" "Something you should have done before raising your hand," I said softly. A message appeared under my thumb, short, clear, decisive. I pressed send. The businessman leaned slightly forward, watching. "Who'd you text?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require announcement, they reveal themselves. Lauren stood frozen in the aisle, eyes darting between me, the passengers, and the front of the plane. Sweat dotted her forehead now. The confidence she'd worn like armor was unraveling thread by thread. Grace knelt quietly to pick up the manifest she'd dropped, her hands trembling. When she rose, her eyes met mine, just for a second, and I saw it there, understanding. Lauren took another step backward. "You can't intimidate me," she said, her voice brittle, too loud for the silence that had swallowed the room. I leaned back in my seat, voice steady. "Intimidation isn't necessary when truth walks in on its own." A hush fell again. No one moved. From the front, the intercom clicked on. The captain's voice came through, calm, professional, but slightly strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing a brief delay before departure." Lauren's face blanched. She looked toward the cockpit, confusion flickering through her eyes. The businessman behind me muttered, "I don't think that delay is about the weather." I set my phone face down on the armrest, folded my hands, and looked straight ahead. Lauren's fate was already in motion, and the flight hadn't even left the ground. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. The sound of the slap still seemed to echo through the cabin, hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Then came the voice, deep, calm, and unwavering. "Ma'am, that's enough." The businessman behind me had risen halfway from his seat, his expression unreadable but his tone absolute, the kind of tone that cuts through status and silence alike. Lauren turned sharply, eyes flashing. "Excuse me." "You heard me," he said, folding his arms. "That's enough. You don't put your hands on passengers. Ever." A murmur rippled across first class. The woman in pearls gasped softly. The older couple who'd been offered champagne earlier exchanged uneasy glances. Someone further back muttered, "She really hit her." Lauren's voice trembled, though she tried to hide it beneath authority. "Sir, I don't appreciate being spoken to in that tone. This passenger has been difficult since—" "She hasn't said a word," he interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "We all saw what happened. You crossed the line." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She straightened her uniform jacket, forcing her posture back into something resembling control. "You're misinterpreting the situation. I was enforcing airline policy." Grace, still standing near the galley, took a cautious step backward. Her phone was in her hand now, hidden just behind the service curtain. She was whispering into it, voice low, tense. Lauren noticed and snapped, "Grace, I told you to stand by." Grace didn't respond. She slipped fully behind the curtain, her whisper fading into silence. Lauren's attention darted back to the aisle. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she tried to mask it by adjusting the overhead compartments, each one already closed. Then she began fussing with the headrests, straightening napkins, aligning pillows that didn't need touching. It was busy work, the kind people do when their authority is slipping and they're desperate to look useful. I watched her quietly, unflinching. When dignity stands its ground, I thought, arrogance begins to tremble. The passengers could feel it too. The energy had shifted. The power she'd wielded so freely moments ago was dissolving under the weight of witness and silence. The businessman slowly sat back down, his eyes never leaving her. The woman in pearls avoided eye contact now, her fingers worrying the edge of her magazine. Lauren spoke again, softer this time, though her tone was still defensive. "I'll have the captain handle this personally. You'll both regret making a scene." Her words were aimed at me, but her confidence didn't land. She was unraveling, not because of what I'd said, but because of what I hadn't. A soft chime broke the tension. The intercom clicked on, and the captain's composed voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to hold position for a few moments before departure. Thank you for your patience." Lauren froze mid-step. Her hand, which had been reaching to adjust another tray, stopped in mid-air. Slowly, she turned toward the cockpit, her brows drawing together. Hold position. The words weren't unusual, but the tone was different. Formal, weighted. Passengers glanced around, confused. The businessman looked toward the front of the plane, then at me. Lauren's lips moved, whispering something under her breath. Her voice no longer carried the sharp edge of command. It carried worry. The hum of the engines softened as if the plane itself was waiting. I sat perfectly still, my phone resting on the armrest beside me. Screen dark now, message already sent. Lauren straightened again, pretending composure, but her face had lost its certainty. The power balance had shifted, quietly, invisibly. She didn't know it yet, but that hold position wasn't about air traffic. It was about her. The faint roar of the engines faded until there was nothing but silence. The sudden stillness made everyone glance up. Even the hum that had filled the cabin since boarding disappeared, replaced by an uneasy quiet that seemed to stretch across every row. Then the captain's voice came again, calm but edged with something unfamiliar. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are awaiting confirmation from the airline's board before departure. Please remain seated." The word board landed differently. Heads turned. Someone muttered, "The board? Since when do they delay a flight for that?" Lauren froze mid-step. Her hand, which had been pretending to smooth a headrest, now clutched it for balance. The faint color in her cheeks drained. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit, then back to me. The businessman behind me leaned forward slightly. "That's not normal," he said under his breath. Grace reappeared from the galley, her phone gone, her posture stiff, but her face unreadable. Her eyes met mine briefly. A moment of quiet confirmation. She knew. She'd made the call. Lauren noticed the exchange and stiffened. "Grace," she hissed through clenched teeth. "What did you do?" Grace didn't answer. She moved to the jump seat and buckled in. The sound of the belt locking was the loudest thing in the cabin. Lauren took a small step toward me, her voice low, dangerous. "You think you can ruin my flight?" I turned my head slowly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You already did that yourself." She blinked, once, sharply, like the words had struck something raw. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she whispered. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I replied evenly. "Someone who mistook a uniform for power." The businessman gave a faint nod of agreement. A few other passengers exchanged glances, no longer hiding their curiosity. Lauren's composure cracked again. She began pacing the aisle, trying to look busy, adjusting trays that didn't need adjusting, avoiding every mirror-like surface that might reflect her unraveling face. She caught the woman in pearls watching her and snapped, "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The woman flinched. No problem at all." Lauren turned quickly away, her movements growing sharper, faster, like she could outwalk what was coming. Then the intercom clicked again. "Miss Lauren," the captain's voice said, measured and formal now, "please report to the cockpit immediately." Every head turned toward her. The businessman raised an eyebrow. Grace looked down, hands folded tightly in her lap. Lauren swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Captain," she replied, but her voice shook. As she walked past me, her perfume lingered, sharp, defensive. She stopped beside my seat, just long enough to whisper, "Whatever you did, it won't work." I didn't respond. I just looked forward, silent, calm. That silence unnerved her more than any words could have. When she disappeared into the cockpit, the door shut with a dull click. The passengers exhaled collectively, as though they'd been holding their breath. The businessman leaned closer. "You sent that message, didn't you?" I gave the smallest nod. He smiled faintly. "Good." Across the aisle, Grace lifted her eyes from her lap. There was something like relief in them now. A quiet recognition that the balance had shifted. Outside the window, ground crew vehicles had begun to circle the plane. Their flashing lights painted faint patterns on the cabin walls. The engines stayed off. Lauren had gone silent behind the cockpit door. And though the plane hadn't moved an inch, everyone on board could feel it. This flight wasn't grounded because of weather or paperwork. It was grounded because the truth had finally taken off. The cockpit door opened with a firm, metallic click that silenced every whisper. Two uniformed security officers stepped into the cabin, their badges glinting under the soft cabin lights. The sound of their boots against the carpet carried the kind of authority that made even the confident sit straighter. Lauren turned immediately, relief flashing across her face. "Officers?" she said quickly, voice brimming with triumph. "Thank goodness, I was just about to request assistance. We have a passenger causing disruption." She motioned toward me, that same smug tone dripping from her words, the certainty that her word would be believed over mine. The taller officer didn't even look my way. His expression remained neutral as he adjusted the radio clip to his vest. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firm but polite, "we need to speak with you, Miss Lauren." The shift in the cabin was instant. Lauren froze. "Me?" she asked, her voice faltering. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," the officer replied evenly. "We've been instructed to remove you from duty pending investigation." Her smile faltered, then collapsed altogether. "Investigation? What are you talking about?" The shorter officer stepped forward. "Captain's orders, ma'am. We've been directed by the airline's executive board." Whispers erupted like a wave rolling through the cabin. "Did she say the board?" someone whispered. "What's going on?" Lauren's face paled. She glanced toward the cockpit, then back at me, her lips trembling with disbelief. "You," she began, but her words caught in her throat. The taller officer gestured toward the aisle. "Please step aside, ma'am." Passengers turned in their seats, openly watching now. The businessman behind me folded his arms, leaning back with quiet satisfaction. Even the woman in pearls who had been whispering judgment earlier now looked uneasy, guilty even. Lauren's breath quickened. "This is absurd. I've served this airline for 12 years. You can't just—" The cockpit door opened again, and the captain stepped out. He was composed, but his expression carried a weight that silenced her instantly. His cap was still in his hand, his eyes scanning the cabin before resting on her. "Miss Lauren," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority, "you're being relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Captain," she tried finally, forcing a laugh that trembled at the edges, "you can't be serious." She pointed toward me, her finger shaking. "She's the one who—" The captain didn't even glance at me. "I've been briefed," he said flatly. "This discussion isn't optional." Lauren's voice cracked. "By who? Who would have the power to—" Before she could finish, the captain turned, this time toward me. His tone softened instantly. "Mrs. Carter?" A collective gasp moved through the cabin like a ripple of wind. Heads turned sharply. Someone muttered, "Mrs. Carter?" Another whispered, "Wait, the Carter." Lauren blinked rapidly, the color draining from her face. "Mrs. What?" The captain gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "On behalf of our airline, I'd like to extend our deepest apologies for this incident. Mr. Carter has already been contacted." Gasps again, louder this time. Lauren's knees seemed to give slightly. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." Grace, still seated at the jump seat, covered her mouth with her hand. Her wide eyes said everything her trembling voice couldn't. The businessman leaned forward slightly, whispering under his breath, "Well, that explains everything." Lauren stumbled for words. "Her husband," she stammered, he's the owner of this airline." The captain finished gently, his tone steady, almost pitying. "And he's requested that we handle this matter personally before departure." Silence. Pure, unbroken silence. Lauren's arms dropped to her sides. The fight left her body all at once. "I didn't know," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow, like she was trying to speak through shame. "You didn't care to know," the businessman said quietly from behind me. The officers stepped closer, their presence final. "Ma'am," one said, "it's time." Lauren's voice cracked again. "Please, I didn't mean, I was only doing my job." The captain's tone remained calm, but final. "Your job was to serve with respect, not prejudice." Her shoulders trembled. For a moment she looked around as if waiting for someone, anyone, to defend her. No one did. The woman in pearls turned away. The older couple avoided her gaze. Even Grace couldn't look at her. Lauren finally nodded weakly and followed the officers toward the front. As she walked past me, her steps faltered. She glanced down, shame heavy in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the words barely left her lips. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because sometimes silence is the only truth loud enough to be heard. As the door closed behind her, the cabin seemed to exhale. The captain faced the passengers once more, his tone composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be ready for takeoff shortly." He met my eyes briefly, a subtle nod of respect, before returning to the cockpit. The businessman chuckled softly under his breath. Guess she found out who belonged in that seat after all. And for the first time since boarding, the cabin felt calm again. The kind of calm that follows justice finding its way to the surface. The captain remained near the cockpit door, his voice calm but deliberate. "We've just been informed," he said, "that your husband, Mr. Carter, owns this airline. He's asked that we handle this matter personally." The sentence hung in the air. Every head turned toward me at once, some out of shock, others out of the uncomfortable realization that they'd misjudged everything. Lauren's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came. She stumbled slightly, her hand gripping the back of a seat for balance. "Her husband owns the airline?" someone whispered near the middle row. Another passenger, the businessman, let out a low whistle. "That explains the captain's tone." Grace pressed her hand against her mouth. The sound that escaped her was part gasp, part disbelief. Her eyes darted between Lauren and me like she was witnessing a storm that had finally turned its winds. Lauren shook her head violently, refusing to accept it. "No," she blurted. That's impossible." The captain didn't flinch. "It's not impossible, Miss Lauren. It's confirmed." The passengers whispered again, the air buzzing with sudden tension and regret. Every pair of eyes that had judged me earlier now softened into discomfort. The socialite in pearls, who'd whispered cruelly just an hour before, looked away, pretending to adjust her scarf. Lauren tried to regain her composure, but her voice cracked under the strain. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I swear I didn't know who she was." The captain's expression was impassive. Respect isn't reserved for recognition. It's required for everyone. Those words hit harder than any slap could have. The quiet approval from the businessman's nod echoed through the silence. Lauren's gaze flicked back to me. Panic, disbelief, and humiliation all tangled together. "Please," she started, her tone almost pleading now. "I didn't mean it was just a misunderstanding." I looked at her, steady, voice low but clear. "You didn't misunderstand, you just underestimated." A collective hush fell. The captain gave a small, respectful nod toward me before addressing the crew. "Grace, please step forward." Grace hesitated, then rose, still visibly shaken. "You'll assume lead duties for the remainder of the flight," he said. "Miss Lauren will be debriefed once we return to the terminal." Grace blinked, speechless. "Yes, Captain," she said softly. Lauren swayed slightly, her voice breaking. "Please, Captain, this isn't fair. I've worked here for years." He cut her off gently. "And in one moment, you chose prejudice over professionalism. We'll address this when we land." Her shoulders sagged. She looked around the cabin again, searching for sympathy, maybe validation, but found none. The passengers she'd once impressed now avoided her eyes completely. Her voice cracked one final time. "I didn't know who she was," she whispered. And that was the truth that stung her most. Not the apology, not the consequence, but the realization that she'd only regretted it after learning who I was. I spoke softly, almost to myself. She didn't know the woman she humiliated was one signature away from grounding her career. Grace looked at me, still holding her clipboard, her eyes shimmering with something like respect. Lauren turned, trembling, as the officers guided her toward the front. The sound of her footsteps faded down the aisle, replaced by the quiet hum of passengers breathing again. The captain straightened. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be ready for departure shortly." As he turned to leave, he paused beside my seat. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "thank you for your patience. I'll ensure this never happens on one of our flights again." I nodded once. "I'm not looking for special treatment," I said softly, "just equal treatment." He gave a solemn nod. "Understood." As the door to the cockpit closed again, I leaned back in my seat. The engines roared to life, smooth and steady, but the silence that followed felt louder than takeoff ever could. Lauren's voice was gone now, replaced by whispers of accountability. And for the first time since boarding, the flight truly felt ready to leave the ground. The cabin door opened again, and the two security officers returned. The tension that had once filled the aisle was now replaced by an uneasy calm. Lauren stood near the cockpit, eyes red, lips trembling, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. The taller officer nodded to the captain. "We're ready." The captain's reply was soft, but final. "Proceed." Lauren's shoulders slumped as the officers guided her toward the exit. Every step echoed like a quiet confession. She passed down the same aisle she once dominated, now stripped of her authority, her uniform suddenly looking too heavy for her frame. No one said a word. The silence that followed wasn't cruel, it was justice settling into place. As she reached the door, she stopped and turned, her voice barely above a whisper. I really didn't know. I didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't about who I was, it was about who she'd decided I wasn't. The officer stepped aside to let her descend the stairs to the tarmac. The sun caught the tears she was trying to hide, but she didn't look back. When the door sealed shut again, a faint ripple of applause spread through the cabin. Not loud, not showy, just a few polite claps from passengers who knew something wrong had finally been made right. Grace stood near the front, hands clasped together, unsure whether to smile or cry. The captain turned to her and said, "Your lead attendant for the rest of this flight." Her eyes widened. "Sir, are you sure?" He nodded. "You've earned it." A mix of gratitude and disbelief crossed her face. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped into her new role with quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly over the intercom, "thank you for your patience. We'll be taking off shortly." A few passengers nodded approvingly. The air in the cabin felt lighter, as if the weight of arrogance had finally been lifted. I turned slightly toward the businessman seated behind me. "Thank you," I said, "for speaking when others wouldn't." He waved it off modestly. "No one deserves what she did," he replied. "You shouldn't have had to go through that to be treated like a person." His words carried no pity, just principle. The kind that still mattered in quiet corners of the world. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, I looked out the window. The clouds stretched endless across the horizon, soft and white, untouched by the ugliness that had unfolded moments before. Funny, I thought, watching the reflection of my face against the glass. People always say respect should be earned, but the truth is, it should never have to be bought. The engines roared to life, the vibration pulsing through the cabin like a heartbeat returning after stillness. The businessman leaned back and closed his eyes. The woman in pearls, earlier so judgmental, now avoided everyone's gaze. Her cheeks were pink with embarrassment, her magazine unopened in her lap. Grace moved quietly through the aisle, offering drinks. When she reached me, she paused. Her voice was gentle, sincere. "Water?" I smiled faintly. "Yes, please." She placed the glass on my tray with steady hands, her expression one of silent understanding. "I'm so sorry for what happened," she whispered. I looked at her, really looked. Young, nervous, but brave enough to care. "You don't need to apologize," I said softly. "Just make sure no one else ever has to." Her eyes glistened and she nodded before moving on. As the plane lifted off the ground, I watched the city shrink below, the buildings becoming lines, the roads turning into ribbons of light. I thought about Lauren, about how small a person's world becomes when it's built on superiority. She'd spent her life measuring worth by appearances, never realizing that dignity isn't something you can see. It's something you feel, the moment it's denied and the moment it's reclaimed. The clouds swallowed the horizon as we ascended higher. The light above them was golden, clean, endless. Respect shouldn't depend on ownership, I thought, but sometimes power forces it into view. The engines steadied, humming strong and sure. Around me, passengers settled in, quiet, reflective, aware that they'd witnessed something they wouldn't soon forget. Justice hadn't shouted that day. It had simply taken its seat and stayed there. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. It was everywhere. Business journals, airline forums, morning talk shows. The headlines read, "Flight attendant fired after slapping airline owner's wife." Carter Airways announces major overhaul of diversity and training standards. The world had finally caught up to what the passengers had witnessed that day. Not just an outburst, but a mirror reflecting something far deeper. The airline released an official statement that spread across every major network. "We condemn any form of discrimination in our service. Our commitment to respect and equality stands above all." For once, a company didn't bury the story under legal phrases or empty apologies. They called it what it was. In a press conference, the CEO, my husband, stood before the cameras. His tone was firm, not performative. "Prejudice doesn't begin at the hiring stage," he said. "It begins with silence. When disrespect is ignored, when bias hides behind professionalism, that ends today." The initiative launched a week later, the Carter Standard, a program dedicated to ensuring that every employee, from pilot to gate agent, would undergo racial sensitivity and inclusion training, not as a formality, but as accountability. Inside the company newsletter, they added a single quote at the top of the page: "Dignity shouldn't depend on recognition." When I read those words, I smiled quietly. Lauren's termination had been formal, public, and permanent. But it wasn't her downfall that stayed with me. It was Grace's promotion. The young attendant who once whispered apologies now led a team, her photo pinned on the staff board under the words, "Integrity in Service." Justice hadn't shouted that day. It had spoken softly, through calm, through truth, through the refusal to bow. I found myself thinking back to the moment that started it all. The sound of ice hitting glass, the dismissive tone, the way a simple request for water had somehow been turned into a spectacle. "They said she asked for too much," I murmured once during an interview. "All she asked for was water." The reporter had gone quiet after that, his pen stilled in his hand. Because he understood, it was never about the drink. It was about what the denial represented. Injustice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it hides behind one. And when people tell you to stay calm, what they often mean is stay silent. But silence never changed a system. As I looked out from my office window weeks later, watching the planes take off under the same logo my family built, I realized something simple. The flight that never left the ground that day had still managed to take the world somewhere it needed to go. Poetic justice line. Racism didn't just cost someone a job, it cost arrogance its altitude. Grace sent me an email a few days after her promotion. She wrote, "Thank you for not yelling back. You gave every woman who looks like us a chance to be seen differently." I replied simply, "The real change begins when people who look like her choose to listen." The next time I flew, I noticed something small but meaningful: a young attendant handing water to an older black passenger with care, not pity. She didn't know who I was, but she didn't need to. That was the point. If you were in that seat, would you have spoken up or stayed quiet? Have you ever faced bias disguised as customer service? Tell me in the comments below. And before you go, remember, stories like this are real, and silence keeps them alive. Like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because silence should never be the end of any story.